I have to catch those of you who have not been doing Bible study with me up to speed a little bit. We've been in the book of Judges. So we're going to be in Judges chapter 6. And I just want to give a little background information as to the things that we've discussed and we've explored. Because it's really interesting, the things that are happening here. The ways that God works, the ways that He's been moving. And in particular, as we read this chapter, we're coming into a place that many of us are familiar with the stories that we're reading. But the context of that story is a period of time in which God is working tirelessly to call a people with whom He has established a covenant relationship, a very unique and very special relationship with, that He is tirelessly working to bring them out of a cycle of rebellion and restore them continually to Himself. Because one of the things that we have found so far, and we're just chapter 6 in Judges, is this, what to us might look like this ridiculous pattern for God's people, in that they see God work, they perceive that it's Him, they renew themselves in a relationship with God, in that they repent of whatever sin of rebellion that they've been pursuing. And they recognize God's working, they're so excited and they're on fire, they're refreshed, and then 4 years or so pass. And the generation rises up, and they do evil in the sight of the Lord, forsaking the covenant that they've established with God and God has established with them. And it keeps happening. And it happens again, and it happens again. And God's people, as you know, prior to the book of Judges, what was happening prior to the book of Judges? If you read right before it, it's Joshua. Joshua was well known for doing what with his people? What did he do? That's right. After Moses had died, God says it's time to cross the Jordan River. We're going to go into the land that I promised you. And He uses Joshua to remind, in Joshua chapter 6, He says, in addition to saying to them, be strong and courageous, He repeatedly tells them to do not forsake me. And He says, do not forsake me. Do not forsake my word. Listen to what I'm saying to you, is what He's saying. Listen, remember the covenant relationship that we have with one another. And be careful to attend to it. Take care of it. Treat it as precious, this relationship that you have with me. Because the day that you depart from it, you're heading off into the path, you're heading off on a path of destruction. And so Joshua reminds them, and they go out, and they do what? Well, yeah, they do, but they take the land that God has promised them. God hands the land over to them, right? This land that for 4 or 5 centuries beforehand God had promised to them through Abraham, remember? So, Joshua dies. And the people almost immediately, 40 years, almost immediately forget the covenant relationship. They forget how important it is. They forget how present God is. And they begin to, and the particular sin, the big sin is this. We don't think of it this way, but the big sin is that they depart from their love relationship with God. And everything else, even the most atrocious, awful things that they do that make us turn white when we just hear those things. We're so astonished by it. All of those things are secondary to the fact that they lost their love relationship with God. They turn to the idols. Why? Because they begin to look around, they take their eyes off of God, right? They take their eyes off of God, they look around, they look at all the other people in the land of Canaan, and they begin to think about how easy a life they have it. They hear this lie that if they worship and intermingle and tolerate the things that the Canaanites do, that they can have a good life, have a convenient life. And it begins to seem to them over and over and over over again. It's just so much simpler. We can just do whatever we want if we just live like the Canaanites and not worry about our relationship with God. Now, we tend to, in our human mentality, to look at the Ten Commandments as all these rules and restrictions and law, right? Isn't that how we tend to look at it? But those things that God gave in the covenant relationship, even the Ten Commandments, were things intended, and it's so true, they weren't the Ten Suggestions. That's absolutely right, they're the Ten Commandments, but there's a reason. Those were commandments of love. Those were the boundaries. Those were the fences that helped the people of God to keep their focus on the Lord. For example, what about the Sabbath? What is the purpose of the Sabbath? You remember Jesus referred to the Sabbath as having been created for men, right? Not men for the Sabbath. So what's he getting at when he says that? Well, he's talking about how God in his love for his creation desires for humanity to follow the pattern that he himself established. After 6 days of work, he rested, right? So on the Sabbath, he wants his people to reconnect with him. And why? Because of their love relationship. God's deep love for us as his people, but also the need that we have for him. God is so loving that the thing he wants us to pursue most in life is himself. Anything else robs us of the purpose and the joy for which we were created. He knows that the worst thing that anyone in this room can do is to forsake our love for him. It's a gift to us that we may have a love relationship with God. So, when, after Joshua died, the people of God, the covenant people, and you know what a covenant is, right? A covenant is a very solemn, very special, what? Contract. What's another word? Contract? Agreement. Commitment. Is that what you said? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Promise. And it's all those things, but yet it's a little bit more. In that, it's very personal. Covenant between two parties. It's not just a business transaction. It's more than that. It's a relational undertaking to prioritize the other person to the point that I'm going to be bound by certain rules and boundaries and so forth, so that you remain to me, like in marriage, you remain to me that special person. God established a covenant relationship with his people. And even though God's people would again and 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 again forsake it, isn't it interesting that God never forsook it? He could have. Because the covenant was like a contract in that way. One side breaks the covenant, then the other side is no longer bound. And Jesus talked about divorce. He said there was one reason that it was permissible. What was it? What? Adultery, right. Adultery. And then of course Jesus said, it's the hardest of your heart that Moses gave you that out there. God is so tender-hearted to us that in spite of the fact that we've broken our covenant, and I'm talking about us collectively, certainly here, but it isn't just the Israelites. We like to pick on the Israelites and how silly they were, foolish, and so forth, but we do exactly the same thing. But God didn't forsake. Now, he would bring them through periods and seasons of discipline, did he not? And actually, Judges is an accounting of that kind of thing. But it's not just in Judges. We see it later on with the kings in Babylon and the virgins and so on, Rome even. There are mechanisms for discipline for his people, not to cast them off not entirely, but in order to bring them back. Because of what? Because God tirelessly pursues love relationship with his people, and he will do what it takes. Even though we don't like it. And I'm glad God will do what it takes in my life to bring me into a right relationship with himself. It means sometimes seasons that I'd rather not go through. It means seasons where there's pain or loss or difficulty or challenge of some kind. But I know that he loves me. That everything that he brings into my life is intended ultimately for me to cling more tightly to him, more desperately to him. It's not always punitive. Sometimes bad things happen in our lives. It's not because they're intended even to punish us. Not every bad thing in your life is a spiritual weapon. Sometimes it's the refiner's fire. There's a lot of nuances there. I don't want to be trite and cliche and say a bad thing happened because there's something wrong with your life. No, not necessarily. Jeremiah, so many of the prophets, Jesus, right? The disciples, Job. So when we come to Judges chapter 6, we've already seen a multiple pattern of where God's people have collectively, now when I say collectively, there's probably always a remnant somewhere. Somebody who's faithful and loving God. So it's difficult to just make such a universal statement and to make it sound like there was nobody who trusted God. There was probably somebody. Actually, when you read about, for example, what Elijah's doing, Elijah's in their country, in spite of all the horrible idolatry and mean, evil stuff going on, they find that one person who was faithful, a widow or whoever, right? So, but collectively, the culture, the people collectively, having been stirred up to follow God at one point, will lose sight of the fact that God was the giver of the blessings, that God was the protector, and specifically, not just any God, but Yahweh God, Jehovah God, right? The God of the covenant. They would take their eyes off of him and they would begin to trust in other things. And even in trusting in their own strength, it's still an idol. Wouldn't you agree with that? Now, most of us don't have little golden statues or stone statues or wooden statues somewhere in our house and on a mantle burning incense to it or anything like that. I've had students who've done that, who come from a different culture. I've had students whose families were Buddhist or something, and they had a little mantle and they had a little Buddha on it, and they burned incense to it. They put offering cakes and other kinds of things on it. Or I've had Hindu students who've done the same thing. Students to whom we witness. Most of us as Americans who, when I say Americans in southern Ohio, this would be a different conversation maybe in Washington State or New England maybe, but here, not many people do that. There's some, just so you know, there are some. But most of us here would think that was the strangest thing ever. But we have our idols. And those idols are those things that take our eyes off of God. Even self-sufficiency. I think that perhaps one of the idols that in Appalachia, America, that we especially struggle with is self-sufficiency. I can do it. I can handle it. I can solve my problems. I don't need anybody. But you know what? That's an idol. Because it turns out I do need somebody. I need the Lord from day to day. I need Jesus because of my sin. I need His Spirit to guide me, to help me. So it turns out I need God. I need somebody, and somebody I need is God. And as Christians too, we're created to be interrelated. We need each other. That's just we want. But all of that to say, it is in our nature as human beings, if we're not attending to our relationship with God carefully, cherishing it and guarding it and protecting it and pursuing Him, we're going to fall into idolatry. We're going to trust something other than God. And that's what happens with these people here. We talked in the past, we talked about Othniel, about Ehud, the left-hand guy. We talked about Barak and Deborah, right? And there's Shamgar. It doesn't say much about Shamgar, so we just never say much about Shamgar, but it doesn't say much about Shamgar. So then we move to Gideon, right? And, well, actually, after Deborah and Barak, we move to Gideon. And it sets us up in chapter 6. I'm not going to read verses 1 through 35, but that is kind of where we read previously. And just to sum up, and those of you who haven't in the study, just to remind you what the situation is. Gideon has been encountered by God in the midst of a time of great oppression for the people of Israel. And the reason they're oppressed is because, like it has been happening in the past, they are now in a cycle of where God has given them over to their oppressors. God didn't just allow it to happen, He instigated it. And so their oppressors, in particular it's the Midianites here, they come and they're like locusts and they're taking all the food away and they're taking their stuff away and they don't let them have anything that can be used as a weapon and they're having to crush their grain in pits and hidden places so that the Midianites don't come and take their food away. And Gideon has an encounter, and it's an angelic messenger through whom God speaks. And Gideon wrestles a little bit, just to summarize, just like Moses did. Who am I? I'm not strong. I'm not a good warrior. Because if you remember, if you read it before, there's a place where God, through the angel, says, "Hey, English, hey, mighty warrior." Gideon vents a little bit, and it's interesting how patient God is with the process of his venting. He doesn't endorse it, but he patiently endures it. And then there's this expression of worship, and God receives it. You read about the bread and the fire and all that. And that brings us basically, and there was an instruction. And that instruction was, I want you to go tear down the Baal. You know what a Baal is? What's a Baal? Idol. It's an idol. That's right. And most of the little city-states in Canaan had their own Baal, but generally they just referred to them as Baal. The Baal, incidentally, translates as master. And it had this negative connotation. It's like a slave master. It's a tyrannical master. There's a period later on in Israel's history when some people think they're talking about God, Jehovah God, and they actually use the title Baal of God. And God's offended by that because of the connotation. God isn't a slave master of his people. He's a heavenly Father who guides and guards and protects and leads his people. So there are these Baals. The Baals are attributed for being responsible for the rains and so forth. And then usually, whether it was a Baal or it was an Asherah, too. And there's a Baal in his father's household and in the town, too. And his father is probably the leading citizen of the community. But he goes and God tells him to tear it down. And he's a little nervous about how that's going to be received, so he does what all brave people do, and that's go at night when I want to watch it. So he goes and tears it down, and they get upset about it. They're afraid probably that not only have they set their affection on this thing, having forgotten God, but also they're afraid probably of offending the Baal. And Gideon's dad says, hey, let Baal take care of himself. So, that brings us to verse 36 and following. That's where we're going to read tonight. I wanted to kind of fill you in as much as we could in a brief amount of time. When we read this, sometimes there's a temptation when we read this particular part of the narrative for Gideon, there's a temptation for us to fixate on the elements of the miracle. Okay? And people will even go so far as to try to duplicate the miracle, and there's a danger in that. because we'll fixate sometimes too much on the miracle, the element of the miracle, and different aspects of it, than the one who sent the miracle. Does that make sense? And so what I'd rather us, we're going to talk about it all, I don't want you to think we're going to skip over anything, but what I want you to really pay attention to as we read it is what does this say about God? And what does it say about me? And what should I do with this information? Or if I were to send it up even further, I'd say, what does the scripture passage we're reading say about God? And what do I do with that knowledge? What do I do with it? Okay? And I'll ask you that in Bible study frequently. Whether we're studying this or something in the Psalms or the New Testament, those two questions. And in your personal Bible study too. What does this say about God? And what do I do with it? How do I respond? Okay? So if you take notes or anything like that, those are two questions to always ask. Okay? We're not just filling our head with knowledge, we're looking to encounter God. Make sense? Okay. So, in verse 36, would somebody like to read verses 36 through verse 40?
Then Gideon said to God, if you will deliver Israel through me, as I have spoken, behold, I will put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I will know that you will deliver Israel through me, as you have spoken. And it was so. When he arose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece, he drank the dew from the fleece, a bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to the Lord, do not let your anger burn against me, that I may speak once more. Please let me make a test once more with the fleece. Let it now be dry only on the fleece, and let there be dew on all the ground. And God did so that night, for it was dry only on the fleece, and dew was on all the ground.
Okay, so if you were writing a news story, what would the answers be to who, what, where, and when? Who are we talking about? Who appears in this passage? Gideon. Yeah. You know what? You said something else. Gideon and God, right. Yeah. So we have the who, the two parties. There's something happening between two different beings here. Gideon being one of them, God being the other. Okay, there's an interaction. So we got the who. What is the what? The do is one of the whats. Materially speaking, physically, is one of the physical things present. The do, the water, right? We all know what who is.
The wool, please.
The wool, the fleece, right? What's a fleece?
Piece of wool.
Piece of wool, big sheepskin, right? Yeah. Especially nice to lay on when you're sleepy, I guess. I don't know if I've ever laid on a fleece before. Sounds like it'd be comfortable. Wrap up in if it's cold, something like that.
Could be itchy.
Could be itchy. Yeah. Now, where would Gideon get a fleece? Okay. Yeah, I wasn't going to spiritualize it. I was just thinking, itchy. But now you say that, Rose. I mean, I'm thinking, oh man, that's profound. A lamb, yeah. And it is, right? Because all of Christianity hinges on the fact that we have a lamb. Right? Okay, so there's a sheep. It's been slaughtered at some point. They've got a fleece. And typically, what would you expect to happen if you, at night, lay a fleece out and you expect the dew to fall? What would be wet? Everything. The ground. The only thing maybe not wet would be the ground under the fleece, maybe, right? I guess. Yeah. But you wouldn't expect one to be wet and the other not. Okay? But what's happened here? Okay, so he has the fleece, and we have the dew. What is it that Gideon wanted? What's he asking? Because he's asking for something, isn't he? Sort of.
The fleece to be wet and the ground not to be.
Trust.
Yeah, and why? And what? Trust. What? It ends up that something unusual like that is a sign. And he needs the sign. He's saying he wants the sign for whatever reason. to build a trust. Whose trust?
Everybody's trust.
Yes.
Okay, I think his and theirs. And maybe doubly his in one sense, because, right, yeah, because he wants to, he's already had a miracle. He's already, there was the angelic messenger that burned up the offering, that kind of thing. So in some way that should be settled, but this is a Moses moment for him. Why is this such a big deal? What was Moses, when God encountered Moses on it had to, interestingly enough, it had to do with Midianites there too. He's in Midian when this happens. He's out taking care of sheep, and he sees a bush on fire that is not consumed by the flame, and God, the I Am, begins to speak to him. And he tells Moses that I want you to go, right? And do what?
Tell other people.
And, well, in particular,
Get my people out of it.
yeah, that's it. He wants him to go and be the one to confront Pharaoh and bring his people out, right? Okay. And Moses says, sure, why not? No, that's not what happened. What happened? Moses has a little indigestion with the request, doesn't he?
He doubted it.
He doubted it, right? And God gives him a few signs. He gives him the leper hand sign. He gives him the staff and serpent sign. But when Moses still being worried about this, it's not enough to just see the physical sign. He asks a question. When I go, what am I to tell them when they ask me who sent you? Remember that question? And how God answered it? Tell them I am sent you. I am that I am. Tell them I am sent you. And this is the name by which I'll be known for all generations and so on. Yeah. Okay. So he knows when he goes to his people, he's going to have more than just his word for it. He's going to have some oomph behind it. And I think, when I read this, that Gideon he's troubled by insecurity on a couple of levels. One, he's already expressed in that he feels he's not strong enough or gifted enough or whatever. Just like Moses, I can't speak, said Moses, right? Yeah. Gideon, I'm the least of my house, my house is the least of the tribe, and blah, 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 right? Moses wanted a calling card to kind of show to his people, listen, I'm not just making this up. Gideon, struggling with his own insecurity, his own weak faith, but also knowing that the people that he's going to have to go through are going to have a bit of a hard time just accepting that he says he's coming from God as a messenger. He wants some assurance. Something that he can brag on God. I think that he's doing this for himself, but I think he's also doing it so he can head off a complaint or an argument that he expects from the people when he says, God said that I'm to tell you that we're going to kick the Midianites out of here. So, God, if you'll do this, I can talk about it. Right? So anyway, but really still the bottom line, I think, is his own insecurity. His own insecurity. But isn't it interesting, though, that here we have hundreds of years after Moses, another person, another servant of God, called by God to do something similar, struggling in the same way. Which makes me think that Moses wasn't really didn't have a unique experience in terms of human feelings and emotions and so forth when God begins to do a work in his life. I see Gideon struggling in the same way. Which means that you and I, when God begins to do a work in our lives, might struggle also in that way. Struggling with, am I qualified enough? Do I have what it takes? We know from the New Testament when it tells us that God takes the weak things of the world, the foolish things of the world, right? To confound the strength of the strong and the wisdom of the wise. So when God does a work in me, Satan likes to undermine that by reminding me how weak and small I am in of myself. So if he can get me to look at how weak and small I am, I'm not really looking at God and his strength. Does that make sense? How important it is to keep our eyes on God. Because He's my strength. He's your strength. So here he is, Gideon, and he says, God, if you'll do this, and it's interesting to me how he words it. If you will save Israel by my hand, you said, take this fleece that I've set out, and if there's dew on the fleece, and it's dew on the fleece, dry on the ground, then I know you'll save Israel by my hand, as you said. How did God respond to that?
Yes.
Did he have to? Couldn't he have thundered and said, you get to it, boy, and turn a bolt with lightning and just lit a fire in them and get to it? He could have done that. He could have, yeah. You know. After Moses went on for a while, remember, it does say God's anger was beginning to get kindled against him. You know, so like we can push it too far. But it's interesting. I think it's compelling to me to see how patient God is with Gideon in this struggle. Because not only does he do it one time, but then after God does what Gideon asks, what happens? He asks him to do it again, except the reverse. And partly so that well, you tell me, why do you think God would be so patient with Gideon in regard to this?
Because he loved him.
Okay, I think you're right.
I mean, he understood his weakness, but he loved him.
What do you think God understood about his weakness?
He wanted to build his faith.
Yeah.
He wanted to build his faith, yeah. Because Gideon doesn't get away easy with this. I mean, he goes into a situation where his faith is tested deeply, and that we won't go into it tonight, but his faith is profoundly tested, isn't it? You know the story. The spoilers here, right? Okay.
But see, God already knew what he was going to face.
Yes.
So he got
And God deliberately arranges the details of it so that Gideon's faith is strengthened.
Yeah.
And who gets the glory? Why is it important? Why is it there are going to be several answers to this, but in your opinion, why is it important that God gets the glory?
Because he deserves it.
He deserves it, and that's the best and greatest answer. There's another reason.
He needs the people to know it was him that caused it to happen.
not the other gods.
Right. So if the problem with his people has been repeatedly that they take their eyes off of God and they begin to place their faith in lesser things, they need to see God do something only God can do.
Yeah. They need to know that God meant business.
Yeah.
You know, he wanted their attention, he wanted to know he was doing it.
So he does something impossible again later, but he sets him up with this impossible thing here, doesn't he?
Do you think that there's a point there in verse 36 at the beginning that it says, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, I shall put a fleece of wool. Is he testing God there to see if he has it? Is he like testing the Lord to see if he'll do it for him, or is he just...
I think that in our English that's one way of taking it, but I think it also was sort of an act of him trying to be humble and not be presumptuous. I don't know. Human nature is such, though, that we can have multiple motives all at the same time. We can have good motives and on one level, and then right under we can have some pretty selfish motives for things too. By the way, when you have a selfish motive for something, don't let that stop you from doing what God wants you to do. God knows you've got the selfish motive. If you have a good reason to do something, God's told you to do it. Don't stop because you see in it a reason that it might benefit you. Let God sort that out. I know that may sound like a strange thing what I just said to you. I've encountered a number of times folks who said, I was going to go and do this work of kindness. I was going to show up in someone's life or put something on their porch or something like that. But I thought my neighbors might see me do it. So I didn't do it at all. But if the Lord put it on your heart to do it, you should have done it. And if the neighbors happen to see it, okay, all right, God will sort out your self-motive. I know that may sound like a strange thing. I don't know. Does anybody ever struggle with it? Does anybody ever thought, I don't know if I ought to do that because it might benefit. Now, I'm not saying it's okay to do something because it benefits you and do things out of selfishness. I know I'm probably making this a lot more complicated than it should be. But do you follow what I'm saying, though? Yeah. So Gideon, I think, on one level, probably was trying to be humble in this moment. He didn't want to presume, even though God had already said it. But if you'll do this, as you have said, I think it was just the expression of the posture of his heart in that moment. So, but, he may have been wrestling a little bit with doubt, too. Maybe God didn't mean it. Maybe he changed his mind. Maybe God says stuff he doesn't mean. I don't know. So because Gideon didn't have up to this point what we would call a close relationship with God. Nobody seemed to at this point. There was an idol in his house that they tolerated and so forth. So it doesn't sound like they were very spiritual in the right ways. But that God intervened and changed that. Okay, so as far as the fleece goes, and so on, what are some ways that people try to duplicate that miracle? Do you think, have you ever heard people say, I laid out a fleece? I'm not saying they're doing a bad thing necessarily. I'm just saying we should be cautious with that kind of thing. I laid out a fleece. What do they mean when they say that?
If something happens, I will do what I think God's leading me to do.
Okay. It's kind of a test to see if God is in something, right? If I think God may be doing this, so I put out a fleece. Sometimes we'll talk about maybe, we're talking about a job, right? We're talking about which job to take. And sometimes we just use it as an expression, So I put out a fleece, and that was, if they were to call me before 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, the one who called me, that's the one. That's sometimes how people will use that expression. I put out a fleece. And that thing happened, and that's how they, that's not always, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. The one thing we don't want it to do, though, is to supplant a real dependence on the Word of God ourselves. And sometimes people will focus so much on a physical miracle thing that they actually don't spend time in prayer and spend time in the Word. And that's not a good thing. The shortcut for some folks is to put up a fleece instead of reading the Bible, praying, maybe talking with some Christian brothers and sisters and getting their input, and learning how to hear the Holy Spirit directly. It's easy to put out a fleece. They don't have to listen. On the other hand, sometimes to strengthen their faith, maybe God will indulge us with a fleece of some kind, but I don't think he ever wants it to take the place of our relationship with him. Does that make sense? So, don't be too quick to use that expression if you're not spending time praying and reading his word in the first place. Because it's easy for the Satan to get you in the posture of peace. And if you're not in the word like you need to be, it's easy to trick us. Funny miracles, right? Okay, so what are some other thoughts on the fleece in Gideon's experience? For many of us, we've heard this story over the years multiple times, and it kind of occurs to me that maybe there's some insights and thoughts that you'd like to share about it. Or not, maybe not. I don't know.
If it's God's will, I'll do this or do that. And it might not be God's will, it just be what I was wanting to do.
Right.
It'd be nice if God showed us that we could see what he wants us to do instead of us just thinking, is this me or is it God working through me?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this shows it pretty blunt.
Right. So why do you think God doesn't just give us quick
A
signs?
smack on the head, tell us get going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he's a God of love instead of a God of punishment.
Right. If God wants a love relationship, like we say that, but what do we really mean by that? Well, would you say that God pursues you? God pursues you. What's the proof of that? If you had to, there are probably a lot of proofs, but if there was one thing in particular, what is the proof that God has pursued you?
He puts it on your heart that you want to be saved,
Okay.
that you want to accept that gift.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's good. Yeah. Other thoughts? If you were wrestling with thinking that God didn't love you, how would you answer that? What is the best biblical and spiritual way to answer that?
Jesus.
Jesus. And what about Jesus in particular?
His death on the cross.
Yeah. God so loved the world, He gave His one and only Son, that whoever believes in Him will not perish, but have everlasting life. God gave His only Son. God gave Him, not just to live among us, but to die for us. So that's how we know God pursues us. I mean, Jesus elaborates. He talks about the Spirit who will come and He'll teach us everything that Jesus had to say to us, and He'll bring to our remembrance God's commandments and so on. Okay. So that's one-sided. That's God pursuing us. It's a love relationship. What else must happen? We must pursue Him. Now, God's patient with that because He knows our fallen human nature and how easily we're wowed by the idols of the world and how we tend to fall into fear and so on. He knows this, right? So He's patient and He gives us the Spirit to help us, but in the end, if it's a love relationship, we must pursue Him too. So, what I think, one aspect that I think that influences is how we relate to God, how we hear God. I mean, if God made everything easy all the time in terms of go this way, go that way, we only look at the signs. We don't look at the one who gave the signs. What did Jesus say about those who, the generation that seeks after a sign, a generation that seeks only after signs? He described them as something. Well, He said they were wicked and adulterous. But then He did signs. He said that He did the signs that they just wouldn't imagine. He was talking about the Pharisees predominantly. He was talking about how they kept saying, well, show us a sign. Well, He'd already been setting people free from demons. He'd already been giving blind people their sight. He had helped lame people to walk. He fed thousands of people with nothing except some crowns. He had given them sign after sign after sign after sign, and they weren't looking. They weren't accepting. They couldn't see them. Spiritual blindness was so heavy on them. And they kept saying, give us a sign. You want a sign. Because they wouldn't see. They didn't want a love relationship with God. And so they could find any excuse not to have one. In religion, we replace the love relationship with God with rules, with rituals, with things that tell us what to do. I had a student years ago who was coming to a Bible study leading on Brian Grant's campus. And some of you know the story, so I'll tell it again because I like boring. He came to me and one day he said, I'd like to come into your Bible study. And he said, I'd like to come to this other Bible study over here. I said, oh, okay, that's cool. Why? Because I don't have to think. They tell me what to do. I find that very disturbing. They tell me what to do. And what he meant was, they tell me who to marry. They tell me when to get up. They tell me what classes to take. They tell me how to dress. They tell me how to think. How lazy is that? That I don't have to think for myself or do for myself. They point, I go. There's no love relationship there. But that's what religion will do. Love relationship, we have to seek after God. That means sometimes we know that we're not going to get the signs, but He's still there. I just need to keep after. I need to keep focused. I need to keep listening So I get in His Word. It's a sign of deep immaturity if our faith requires signs. Make sense? And the test of our maturity is if we'll persevere without signs that He's not already given us. Does that make sense? You and I are being tested on that over and over again. There'll be seasons where it's quiet, we don't know where God is, we don't know why He's not showing up, we don't know why He didn't change this. And we wonder if He loves us. And when we're in those moments, we have to get back into His Word and remember that He pursued us. He loves us. And just because I can't hear Him right now, just because I can't see Him right now, doesn't mean He doesn't love me. It means He's waiting for me to hold on to Him. And He gives me as a chance to grow in my relationship with Him and to experience the joy of loving Him, the opportunity to persevere through hard times and affliction. And my flesh says, give up. I believe it's a gift from God at times for us to have hearts. Not that we can prove to the world how great we are, but that we have an opportunity to say to God, you are worth the pain. You're worth the wait. And I'll leave it there. Do you have any final thoughts or comments? I want you to know how deeply God loves you. The God who just showed up in Gideon's door and watching Gideon, loving Gideon, was present with Gideon long before Gideon knew he was there. He understood where Gideon struggled. He understood why Gideon struggled. He didn't get angry with Gideon because Gideon struggled. He loved him through it. And loved him through it to a place where Gideon's faith could grow and he could know God and who God really is. That's what God does in us. That's what God does for us. Let's pray. Father God, we bless your name and we thank you, Lord, that we have the opportunity to be challenged in our walk, Lord. Just as Gideon was, Lord, you come in and you move in our lives in unexpected ways in our circumstances. And Lord, sometimes the path is pretty pleasant and sometimes it's pretty painful. It doesn't change who you are, Lord. You're a good God all the time. And you love us all the time. And you never forget us, nor do you forsake us, Lord. You are patient and you love us, Lord, through our hardest moments, Lord. And you are working, Lord, to prepare us for an eternal home with you. And we thank you for that truth. We pray that as we leave here tonight, Lord, that you would just impress upon our hearts and our minds just how great is the treasure we have in Jesus Christ. And how real and powerful your Spirit is as He works in us, your will. And that as we leave here, Father, we have before us a path that you've prepared. That we might not only know you, but we might also experience you and bear fruit for you. Because, Lord, you are worthy. As was shared, Lord, you are worthy of glory. Thank you that you share yourself with us tonight. Every time we look to you and trust you. I pray every life, every heart here, Lord, would be encouraged by your presence, by your love, Lord. And I pray this in Jesus' name.